What is a nectar flow?
So what is a honey flow and how can that influence the way you manage your bees? How can you get the best out of your bees by knowing what your nectar flows and honey flows are? I've been meaning to do this video for quite a while and I've mentioned it a few times before. So the reason why I haven't done it up till now is because it's one of these videos that I've been thinking about how I want to explain to you. And there's several things I want to bring up in this video that actually help me and have helped me understand the nectar flows. Okay, so what our questions asked before is what is a nectar flow and what is a honey flow? I think they're two of the same thing. They're both a period. According to the books, I've Googled it, I've looked at different books by many, many authors, and some don't say anything about it, some say quite a bit about it, but they all refer to a period of flowering when there's an abundance of food around, abundance of nectar available to the bees. And if you work on that, that's how you get good results. So why do we need to know about when a good nectar flow is? Well, for me here, where I am, and the whole thing about this is it's so specific to where you are, okay? For us here, we have, for instance, a very short set of nectar flows. We have about a 4 to 5 week flow in the spring, which some people might say is quite a good flow. And I would actually say that's probably our strongest flow. And then we have a gap. And then we, from about mid-June to mid-July, we have a chestnut and bramble flow. Okay, so that's absolutely fantastic for us. And it is a really good flow, but it only lasts about 4 weeks. So I wanted to try and explain why it was so important that we need to know our flows and how we can get our bees ready to profit from those flows. You see, to me, there's no point in trying to put a colony of bees to collect honey if you've got it all wrong. To collect honey from a good flow, you first of all need the right bees, bees that are known to be prolific at gathering honey. You need a good sized colony so that their surplus bees can bring in that extra, you know, the exponential of how much extra you get. You also need foraging hours, and you need temperature, and you need humidity, and you need the flowers on the trees or whatever they're on. There's like the most important things you need. It's a combination of things. Sometimes flows come along and your bees don't profit from them for one reason or another. Either they swarm, or the colony requeened, or it was cloudy and cold during that particular peak of the flow. Or for instance, say your colony was starving before the flow came along and you thought, hang on a minute, I've got a flow coming. I don't need to feed them. I'll wait till the flow comes. That's false economy, because what happens is they spend the first 2 weeks of the flow recovering from the dearth they sort of had before, and then when they do get going, they've only got a couple of weeks foraging and probably on reduced numbers. The whole idea of knowing your nectar flows is that you can get your bees in the right place at the right time, well fed before, so that the colony is absolutely full already or near as damn it, and all they're going to do is put honey up onto your supers or in frames or in whatever device you use. So that they're not going to put it, for instance, they're not going to have to fill around the brood nest first so they've got food. They're going to put it in the place where they want to store it. And that's where you come along as the beekeeper and you give them that storage just at the right time. So how did I come about doing this video? Well, to me, it's a combination of things. I want to, in a minute, explain my season and my flow so you can understand how I work it. And also I want to give you a bit of a story. So about 10 years ago, when I first started beekeeping, I was lucky enough to bump into a chap who was selling bees. And his name was Charles Basset, and he was the local beekeeper around here. He lived in Dearth, which is about 20 minutes from here. But he's one of these guys, when you meet, that immediately he picks up on the fact that you want to learn about bees. So I went down to meet Charles one evening, and all I can say is it changed my life. When you meet someone who immediately, probably like myself now, that immediately realises when you want to learn about bees, they don't stop talking and they answer all your questions. And that's what this guy did to me. He knew that I couldn't speak very good French, and I knew that he couldn't understand much of my English, but we managed to get a really good rapport going, and I could feel his enthusiasm to help me out. And obviously he was going to sell me a colony of bees, but yeah, I ended up buying 2 that first year. So he took me into his shed, and all I can say is when I knew a little bit about bees, and I've been doing some stuff on the internet and trying to find a few books and stuff like that. And I went into his shed, and well, it was like an Aladdin's cave. It was like I was like a schoolboy in a candy shop. It was like unbelievable. There was frames, there was wax, there was honey, there was pots, there was anything you can think of connected with beekeeping, but all in his shed, kind of in a time capsule of how he was working. And it was fascinating because I could see all these things that I thought was amazing. Now looking back now, I would say some of his methods are not the methods I would follow today, but it worked for him, and he knew his flows, and he knew everything about getting honey, because all he was interested before he changed to just producing bees was harvesting honey, and he knew how to harvest honey. And the whole point of explaining this meeting was when I got talking with him a few weeks later, he said to me, don't bother putting a honey super on your bees after the 2nd week of August. And of course, with my first 2 hives, I knew everything. I was like, the rookie newbie, and I was thinking, what is he on about? The bees are still foraging. They're coming in with pollen and nectar. What is he on about? And guess what? I was completely wrong. He was right. And over here in France, really, the 2nd week of July is when our nectar flow just stops. That is it. And from that day on, I realised that a few things, but the most important thing was never ever close your ears to the old boys or the old timers who've done it for years, because they know the area. They know what goes on in the area to the date, as good as. Okay, some years it's a little bit variable, but I've done this now for 10 years. This is my 10th year this year. And I have to say that every year I think it's going to be later this year, it's going to be earlier. But it doesn't seem to be. The chestnut trees, for instance, in the summer come out later some years, and you think, oh, they're never going to be in flower by 2nd week of June. And they are. No book you can buy is ever going to give you the knowledge of your specific area. It's like in my queen rearing video. I say, I'm not here to tell you how to raise your own queens, because every area is different. Well, it's exactly the same for your honey. Every honey flow, every nectar flow is different. You've just got to scour your area, look at the books, use a combination of local knowledge and experience to make sure your bees are ready for that unique period in your area. There's nothing else you can do but do that. So you use the local knowledge. Go there and have a drink with someone. Even if you don't like them, they won't be there forever. So I was really grateful I did get to know Charles really well, because sadly he died at the end of 2017. He got a cancer that was non-operable, and unfortunately he passed away. Very sad, and unfortunately he was lost to the beekeeping world, and it was a great loss. So as well as teaching me about beekeeping, he taught me a lot of unique things that actually started me in beekeeping. He also taught me about swarm trapping. Now, he only dealt with the native AMM, or we call local black bees, Apis mellifera mellifera. In other words, what other people refer to as the muck that flies around. Now, the interesting thing is now I would probably agree with that sentiment, because I don't work with AMMs. I try and work with the buckfast type bee and their hybrids. So Charles was an avid bee trapper, and he lent me one of his nukes that he used for trapping bees. And he taught me how to make it into a bee trap, how to prepare it, how to get it just right. And guess what? I started trapping swarms, and that's how I started with my bees. I bought 2 colonies, but from then on, every year, and also I had, being in the gardening business, I had loads of clients with gardens, so I went and put traps in their gardens, and it was all fun because I didn't have to go and check them. I was always going to their gardens to do work there. And guess what? I caught swarms, and it was all exciting. And I learned so much from him about how bees behave, how they swarm, what they do, how they build up, and it was all because he taught me how to trap swarms. I'll never ever be anything but grateful for that, because to me, if you're going to move on in beekeeping, you have to start with a good foundation, and he gave me that foundation. What you have to realise in life is there's many people around who are full of knowledge, and no matter what you do, you need to grab that knowledge while you can. Don't leave it till the week after. You go and see someone straight away and you learn. And I feel that I probably had one of the luckiest starts to my beekeeping career that anyone could ever wish for. You didn't have to worry about paying the bills when you're messing around with a few swarm traps in people's gardens. That's really what it looked like. And I think a lot of people who I met and who I put swarm traps in their garden think I was completely potty. They think I was completely off my trolley because all I was interested in was catching bees, and I'd turn up in the garden just to see if there's any activity, and I'd watch the front, seeing, oh, was that a bee coming and going? Or was that a bee, was that 3 or 4 bees? Or was that, you know, just pre-swarm arriving? And I would do that, and you get really intent on checking these swarm traps like no one else does. And until you've experienced that, you won't understand it, but I'll be forever grateful for that knowledge. And I think it's really a great thing for someone to be able to go through. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to run through a series of photos and pictures and video of the flowers that we have through our season, and tie that in a bit to how we manage our bees, and try and explain in terms of brood management, in terms of what we're doing and when. It's going to be a little bit long-winded because I'm going to try and explain each main group of flowers we have, but it's the only way that I can really really kind of explain. And excuse me if I don't cover everything, but what I'm doing here is I'm doing our main groups, okay, and roughly the dates and times. So our winter time is when it's all quiet, and for us our winter time is really a time, as you already know, for reflection and reading bee mags and drinking lots of coffee and surmising about how wonderful the following year is going to be. But in reality, our winter actually starts in probably the 3rd week of November, because by then, basically, our nectar flow from the ivy has finished. It's the end of that complete season. The bees are fed, they're going into their winter, their mites are treated, we hope, and then we're going into winter, and then we start getting colder weather. So we go through December, which is when we'll do either our trickles of oxalic acid solution, or we'll do oxalic acid vaporized, which is my preferred treatment midwinter. That's when we seem to have the smallest amount of brood, probably virtually none, but some winters we have some, other winters we have none at all, depending on how cold it is. And this winter we've actually got virtually no brood, so I've been out oxalic acid treatment on everywhere at the moment. So we get into mid to late January. What's flowering then? Well, not much, but we start to have the first hazels. And you'll see, as I knock the tree, you'll see the pollen coming off in clouds, absolutely clouds. The only other thing that's around then is we start to see things like camellias. A few camellias around. There's lots of gardens around here that have camellias. They're like France tends to have a lot of standard shrubs that are basic, but not many like English gardens where you'd see a wide variety of herbaceous perennials or things like that come out later in the year, obviously. But you don't get you get standard things like camellias. So the camellias come to flower in say about February time, and then that kicks into March. Now March gets interesting because we have a few flowers that start to flower in March, like Sarcococca, which is a really strong smelling shrub. We also have Lonicera fragrantissima, which is a form of honeysuckle. Now I plant this all around my bees, as you'll see in the video, and it's absolutely brilliant. So we go into sort of March time then, end of March, and then we get the first things that really come in, the first big things. We get the really early plums, in other words, the really early blackthorns and then the willows. Now we have goat willow here, which is obviously fantastic. And in the end of March, if it's warm enough, which often it is, not always. This last winter, 2018, was pretty poor early on, so they missed a lot of the goat willow. But it's pretty prolific when it starts, and when it does, that's when things really kick off. Because we don't believe in winter pollen patty feeding here. We would think it might be beneficial in the spring, but the problem is by the time the bees start flying here, pollen patties wouldn't be much use, because by the time you've got them on, there's more pollen coming through the door than the bees know what to do with. So we're now sort of into March, April now, and as well as all the goat willows being in flower, we start to see other things like primulas. Now in France, you have a lot of primulas. They're the little yellow cowslips or primulas, they're very much the same. You have a lot of those in the side of the roads, in the ditches where they cut. So in France, we don't have the hedgerows that you do have around the UK, for instance. And I don't know what so many other countries have, but France, they just generally have ditches. But the ditches aren't too bad, because even though they're mowed down to nothing every year by a flower mower on a tractor, inside those ditches you have these small cowslips or primulas. as well as that coming into flower, you have other things like gorse. Now we have a lot of gorse around here, and gorse has one of the highest protein amounts in its flowers, and it's prolific. Anywhere that's scrubland here, we have gorse. It's absolutely wonderful. So we're going into this period where really the bees are really starting to build up. They're really getting going. They're thinking, right, great, everything is up for us now. There's never a problem finding pollen. It's the problem we have this time of year is flying weather. That's when it can be critical. It's when you can get cold, and that's when you've got to watch your nukes. Now, nukes in April are like, 1 minute they're perfect, next minute they are dead because they've starved. And that's why you have to feed. As soon as the nectar, you see pollen coming in, that's a sign, one of the signs that your queen is probably really brooding hard. But it doesn't mean there's nectar coming in. It's the biggest mistake people make. And I've made it, and I'll probably continue to make it because I think they're heavy and maybe they're not. And you go and check the weight and you think, oh, that's all right, but is it the nuke's just heavy because it was wet over the winter? That's how I got caught out. So you have to be on the ball. And it's not until really the 3rd week of April you can almost say, oh, I think I'm all right. Because as soon as those temperatures creep up to 16 to 18 degrees, or you have a flash, a bit of a heat through, then you can go, oh, we've got nectar coming in as well as the pollen. And that's when it really goes mad. So as the season progresses, there's things like anemones in the woodland. They're little ground cover anemones that come out. You get, as well as the goat willow, you get a lot of mimosa that have massively bright yellow flowers. We've got false quince in people's gardens that makes hedges. We have then the poplars start flowering. We have more and more blackthorn and the other types of prunus, as well as other little ground cover plants that people have in rockeries, you know, like heathers. There's some ericas that people have that are spring flowering, not the later heathers that you get in August here. Then you've got things like magnolias. It really is a time where everything is going mad. I mean, there's so much pollen out there. There's almost too much. And don't forget, then we start onto the pear trees and all the apples, all the malices, all that stuff starts flowering. But what I'm also saying is a lot of these groups overlap. So I'm not thinking them absolutely specific. They're in the spring, really from April to the end of May, till mid-May, it's all a much of a muchness. There's just so much out there. If the weather's good, the bees will be flying, you know. Other flowers like Prunus padus or bird cherry, known as common bird cherry, absolutely prolific with flowers. Then we get the ceanothuses, that's the bright blues, absolutely fantastic, and bees go mad on that. Portuguese laurel starts to flower, and that is amazing in the amount of volume of flowers it gives. Then we go into the cherries. And the cherries, the wild cherries start first, then you get the cultivated cherries, and it's like the bonus time, you know. Your bees by this time are starting to put real amounts of nectar in, and this is when your supers go on. When the cherries come into flower, your bees should be really up to speed for us here to start taking nectar, okay? So then it really is kicking off. There's so much around, the bees are going mad, and then you get the dandelions coming into bloom, and then it really does kick off, because what happens, the oilseed rape comes into flower, okay, as well as the apples, okay. So those two groups, oilseed rape for us flowers for about a month, okay. So often there'll be not much at the start of it, but really if you get wet weather and it goes warm and you get a hot spell, which you often do in May, oilseed rape is the one. I mean, just look at that. It's absolutely amazing. The fields are blindingly yellow. The smell is just so rich. I mean, a lot of people hate it, but for us, it's one of the main nectar times. And we always say that our honey crystallizes really rapidly because of it, but it's not just because of the oilseed rape. It's because of the all the other spring flowers as well. They all cause early crystallization. Well, the majority do. So our bees go mad on this, and it's a time of absolute bonus. All you're doing by this time, hopefully, is going around boosting weak colonies if there is any left, but also putting supers on, because that's what you've got to do. You've got to put supers on, because if you don't, you get swarming starting. And this is at the start of our swarming season. This is when we start making queens, because that's what the bees start to do, because there's just, all the hives are getting congested. They're all getting full of nectar, and the ones that you miss will start to swarm. Don't forget, we've got the maples here as well. These are the aces. They all come in mid to late spring for us. And when you've got an area that have urban areas as well as rural areas, you tend to get a good mix of pollens because the bees are going in every direction. So you benefit from the city shrubs, and you also benefit from the oilseed rape and the main crops in the field. This all then comes to a head when our hawthorn comes into flower. And when our hawthorn comes into flower, that is basically signals the end of our spring flow. But hawthorn is wonderful because I have a huge hedge I planted myself in the garden here. It's 150 odd meters long. I love it because it feeds the birds in the winter, and I love it because the bees go mad in the spring and summer. And it gives me a time, it's the clock in the garden that's ticking. I know that when that hawthorn comes into flower, those beautiful white flowers, and the apples are all in full bloom, I know that it's virtually the end of our spring flow. So I'm thinking about my honey extraction within 2 weeks. I'm looking at thinking about how I'm raising my first queens and timing that. Because we have a gap coming up now. We have a gap coming. We have horse chestnut, the flowers, conker trees we call them here, and then peonies and things like tamarisk and commercial apples. The cider apples, for instance, they are prolific over here. And they're the ones that are come the latest. Our cider apples seem to be the very last thing. There's things I want to talk about as well that you can plant. What you need to do when your flow finishes is look at what actually is in flower still. Now, it might not be that flow is going to continue enough if you enhanced it with what is in flower. So for instance, we have cotoneasters here. So say I went out and bought a load of cotoneasters and planted a huge bank of it. The reason why I do that is not to continue my flow, but to continue a kind of flow where I would still have pollen coming in. What I want to do is also in this video is also explain that planting for bees is all about making sure there's something around. You're never going to be able to plant unless you've got your access to wide resources and machinery and huge acres of fields. You're never going to plant enough things that will give you a flow yourself. You've got to rely on what's around, but you can enhance what you've got around you, and you can speak to people around and get them, for instance, if you know a farmer, to sow some facile that will come into flower for us between mid-May and mid-June before the nectar flow starts again. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. A lot of people say to me, oh, well, I've got these bees and I went out and bought a dozen lavender plants and I can't wait. The bees are all over the lavender plants. It's fantastic that I've been able to give them. I can't wait to taste the honey from them. There won't be any honey from those 10, 12 plants you bought, I'm afraid. The reality is that bees need a massive and wide range of plants. And if they're going to have a specific plant, you need to put your bees on an area this big, for example, to get nectar in large enough amounts so you could say that was nectar from, for instance, a lavender. What's happening then? We've got the oaks coming to flower. And the oaks are something that's overlooked. It's fascinating because you go out, there's oaks are in green leaf, and you've got these dirty catkins hanging leaf. But actually, that's the oak's flowers. And the bees actually, they can be on it for 2 or 3 weeks, and it's a really good pollen gap when there's not much else around. Following on from that, we get genista, or we call it broom, which is wild broom. That is pretty prolific here as well because it's very scrubby and dry, and it's excellent. Moving on from that, we get dock leaves in the hedgerows that, because the farmers haven't come along and flailed down the grass yet, we get a lot of docks with the seed heads waving around in the wind like that, and that's our dock leaves. And then we're really into the small things. The small things I was on about before, like the cotoneasters, like the cotinus, like weigelias, like beans, field beans we have. People plant fields and fields of beans. Now, if it's wet and there's a lot of moisture in the ground, we get a hot spell, beans can really produce well. That really is our spring. That's it, finished. At home here, I actually have, through no actual planned planting, I have a lot of wild parsnip and a lot of euphorbia. And my bees absolutely love that. And I've kind of left it because it's a really good plant that flowers when the rest of the stuff is finished. And I don't ever think it gives me nectar, it just gives my bees some pollen. And I have it all around my queen rearing apiary. So that's another thing that is really good to have around. It's all about identifying the plants you know that might enhance the periods when there isn't the main flows on. That's what you have to do if you want to plant for bees. So we're now making nukes and splits and harvesting honey and raising queens. It's all complete chaos. There's just never a minute you have spare. You are just juggling and crisis management, to be honest, in your apiaries. There's nothing else really you can do than that. Your days are long. You are trying to do everything you can to get the honey in the barrel or in the pot. Keep an eye on your queens, making your nukes, trying to time it so that, and that's when it all starts. That's when queen rearing really is kicking off in full. Because when you've got nukes you've made, you really need to be able to get those queens ready and timed so that you can introduce them at the right time, because there'll be drones around by then. Our drones start mid to late April. in early May, and then we're talking now mid to late May, and which is when we get this gap. And in some respects for us, the gap is quite good because we get time to raise queens. Now, other people have continuous flows all the way through. When I was in Vermont, for instance, you never really have a stop in the flow. You do have times when there's less nectar coming in, but it's almost continuous. Obviously, I've just been to Hawaii. Their flow is 24/7, 365. It's just incredible. So none of that, what I'm talking about, applies there, for example. But it's all relevant to your situation. So we get to mid to end of May, and by then we're then thinking, right, we've made our nukes, we're well on the way to raising some good queens, and they're out for mating, on the first mating, that kind of thing. If the weather's been good, it's sometimes really towards the end of May before we get our first queens mated. But most years it's sort of first and second week of May we can start making queen cells, so mating towards third, fourth week. But this is what I'm on about, is that you have to be organised, because 2 weeks later is the start of our main flow. And what we have to do then is we have to decide how much bees do you take from a strong colony, that not to make it dwindle so that when the next flow comes along it's still recovering, but just enough so that you can take a very small swarm from it, a very small nuke from it, 2 or 3 frames of bees. If it's colossal colony, really good build up, a good queen, but leaving enough so that they'll still profit from the next flow. Or what you could do is split the colony in 2 and make 2 nukes or 3 nukes. Don't forget, a colony that is non-productive in the spring doesn't mean you can't divide it into 2 or 3 or 4. You could do that on all the colonies that didn't give you any spring honey, and you'd have plenty of nukes to make into hives into big colonies for the following year. That's what you need to be thinking about. So we arrive at the first and second week of June, knowing that our main flow is about to start. We can see the brambles coming into bud. You can see the chestnut fronds there virtually in flower, and thinking, right, so we go around all our colonies, and this is when we feed. This is when we give a feed, because if we've taken a colony if we've taken a frame or 2 frames of bees and brood from a colony, that's had a significant impact on that colony. So we need to replace that quickly, and we need to keep the bees in a manner that they're continuously working. The bees aren't becoming idle, going, what's happening? Because there's no nectar around. That's what happens. They almost stagnate a little bit. You've got to keep them moving, keep them going. So you feed, and even if you feed 2 or 3 euros per hive of sugar syrup, that is a really good investment, because you will profit so much more, because your bees will be hitting the ground running when that flow starts. You'll put your supers back on, or they'll be on, and you add other supers, and then sure enough, boom, 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 they're into the second and the third super, because the bottom brood box was full. The bottom brood box was at the point where they're thinking, it's almost swarm time again, but we seem to have this great thing here that most of our swarming impulses happens in early spring. We don't seem to have a problem so much with summer swarming. So as far as we're concerned, we can feed as much as we want at the end of the spring gap, and it always reflects on our honey. It always helps our honey flow in the summer. And we've tested, and we know there's no nectar going into the supers, because we take off the feeders a good 10 days before at the start of the flow, so we know that everything they take down is gone in. We don't basically take the feeders off full, we take them off and they're always empty anyway. So then we're ready for that summer flow, and the summer flow can be absolutely prolific. And the chestnut trees we have around here are amazing. Everything was designed to have chestnut here. All the valleys are full of it. It's a wood that they use a lot for firewood, because it has a high calorific value, and so they can cut it down and it reshoots from the stump. We are lucky in Northern Europe at the moment. We still have fantastic chestnut. We haven't suffered the problem that America had with the disease that killed a lot of the chestnut trees. Just to mention as well, just before the chestnut starts, we have the lime trees. If you have an area that has several huge lime trees, that can be a really good flow. It depends on many things, and often your bees are in a good state, and if you have an apiary near a good lime grove, or a lime, plantation maybe you call it, you can do really well. So as I said before, at the end of the chestnut flow, that really is it. We're then into what's left on the ground, which is like a few thistles. There is one crop of pollen that comes along, and that is farmers' maize. Now we call it maize here. In America they call it corn. But for us, the farmer's maize is a really good bonus because putting aside what it may contain, chloroprothorm or all these chemicals that farmers may treat the maize with, I'm not talking anything about that. For us, we ignore that. We just get on and use the maize for its pollen because we can't do anything else. And bees bring it in prolifically because there's nothing else around really. And it's like sitting there just waiting for them. So for about 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks, we have a pollen flow of maize. So that's great when you're rearing queens because you've got more stuff coming through the door. And the bees can really profit from it. From then on, we move into end of July, August, and then we usually have this big dearth where there's nothing around. It can get very dry. There's very, very, very few flowers around. The chestnuts shriveled up. They drop their catkins end of July. And when the chestnut trees drop their catkins, getting back to Charles Basset, he always taught me that when the chestnut trees drop their catkins, that's when you make your splits. And that's when we do make most of our summer splits. But 3 or 4 weeks of queen rearing left, and that's when we really have to work hard. So we've got hardly any food coming in. We have to really start cranking up the feed on our cell builders to really get those queens going, to give them the carbohydrate they need. They've got the pollen. There's never a problem with pollen because after the chestnut flow's finished, there's absolutely loads of frames you can pull out of a hive that will give you the pollen you need to raise good queens. And I've actually found, because after the flow stops, there's less congestion in the colony, there's no swarming, you can really manipulate that colony even better to have just wonderful clean queen cells with no wax or anything built up around the cell. And I find I've had my best takes and my best grafts in the first 2 or 3 weeks of August, because really the 3rd week of August is our last graft. That is pushing it. That is pushing us because we have to get those queens mated and we've got to feed. And we're heading then into autumn, winter. Now, autumn for us is all about getting the bees ready for the ivy flow. Again, 1st, 2nd week of September, we're going around checking bees, see if they need feed. Because if you don't feed them in the summer, along comes the ivy flow, and what's happened? They are desperately dry. You've pulled all their honey off them. They've had nothing to use during that summertime. And you pull the honey off them, and what's happened? The bees are absolutely hanging in there. I had colonies last year I had colonies the year before last that I didn't understand about feeding. And as I said, I've been learning all the time in my journey into beekeeping here. Even after all these years, I still didn't get it. And I've realised now that you've got to feed late summer because our dearth is so bad that you really need to feed. Otherwise, when the ivy flow comes along, it'll take them 2 weeks to recover before they can profit from the ivy. So you give them all a feed, you keep them going. Along comes our ivy flow that really starts the 2nd week of September and then carries on through, to be honest, all the way into October. It really reaches a peak in mid-October. And if we have warm weather combined with some moisture in the ground, which often we've had some rubbish August, and actually our best ivy flow I've ever experienced was 2016 when we had a dirty August. It rained every day, terrible for camping. It was a complete disaster for the tourist season. But guess what? Our bees had an amazing October, September time because there was so much nectar. The hives went into the winter completely full. And that for us is our free feed. It's not something we rely on, but if it comes along, it's fantastic because next spring we open the hives and they're still full of honey. None of our hives here ever run out of stores in the winter. Generally, our colonies are strong enough, down on 10 frame hives to survive the winter on what they have. And we've never ever found a time when they've run out. They might run out in the summer, but if you set it up right for them so they're ready to go, by the time the autumn and winter comes along, they are absolutely flying, they're full, they've got their bee numbers up, the mites numbers are down, you've treated them all, you've got everything ready, and they're going into that winter strong and healthy and clean, and that's how we finish the year. That's our year of beekeeping. So I started off in the winter, we're back to the winter, and that's basically what we do, and around those 2 main flows. So you can see for us, we don't actually have a lot of nectar, and we have to really push things to time everything so that you get the best of what you can with what you have. Now I want to talk about planting for bees that I did mention before, and it's just to reiterate the most important thing that if you are planting for bees, what you're really aiming to do is give them something. So you go out in the area and when you know there's no nectar flow running, you look at what is in flower and you try and find some shrubs from that type of flowering period that you can plant and enhance. That's your best bet. And one of the books I found to be the best book to have is this one. It's by Sarah Wyndham Lewis and it's called Planting for Bees. Okay, it's absolutely fantastic book, and it literally is one of the nicest books I've ever had because it's a joy to have in your hand. And it's got some brilliant flowers in there, a complete cross-section of what will be good for you to plant, and I really recommend you get that. And I'll put the ISBN number up, and it's on Amazon. You can buy it and it's not that expensive. It's a really, really good book, okay? My whole message in this video is please go out and be broad-minded. Please go out and look at everything you got and take it all in and use your time wisely. Think about what you know, think about who you know knows what, and go to them and ask and find out the dates, find out what they say about what happens, because every area is different. So it's all about getting your bees in the right place at the right time. If you have hives that are non-migratory, you just need to know and get your timings right, and you need to be able to understand how it all works. And the minute you grasp that, the minute you'll start to see results, the minute then you can start to do your timings, to know when to feed and not to feed, to save yourself money, to really profit from what you have. Hope you enjoyed the video. See you again soon. Bye for now.